I arrived at the AA and I kind of, in a kind of, not necessarily wanting to study architecture, but I had friends who kind of went to the AA and I lived with them, and I really like this kind of self-determined nature in the AA, that you choose your own units, you choose, somehow you are in control of your pathway a little bit, and that there's a lot of responsibility given to you as a learner in a way, to kind of guide yourself. And I really treasured this. So I felt that's a place I want to be, because of that nature more than because of architecture. I always wanted to do, I think, graphic design or photography or industrial design. But it was that kind of environment in which you learn that attracted me. And the intensity of it, I felt it was quite, it felt like, you know, things were demanded of you, which I quite enjoyed. And I guess going through it, what Shin gave me is a certain confidence and trusting intuition. I think Shin works quite intuitively. At least I felt it doesn't get resolved in the head first, and then somehow you follow what comes out of your head, but it came more through the hand. And I think with Pascal, it was, I think the idea of narrative, I think also memory and emotions, and maybe also urbanism in a funny way, or kind of questioning the material and the immaterial. And I think that opens up a whole other field of practice. And with Raoul, it was really interested in public realm and into the processes of city making, you know. And I feel the transition into practice was that I met two artists, Catherine Böhm and Stefan Saffer, and they had a socially engaged art practice. And I met them through a project we did with Raoul. And I quite liked how they thought about social processes starting to create space. Okay, it was in a gallery context, a little bit outside, but that resonated with me in terms of the work I've been doing, which was always about how architecture is kind of in dialogue with other processes going on around it, and how these processes can be formative of the architecture or generative. So this kind of dialogue was quite interesting to me. And I think pretty much as I left, Catherine and Stefan invited me to join one of their projects. And that was quite a fluent and organic collaboration. And that's where the kind of mobile porch came out of. I don't know if you know, it's kind of, it was a residency under the Westway flyover. And we proposed this mobile kind of structure you put around and unfold. And it wasn't quite clear what it is, but it could be many things. And that became nearly a tool to understand public realm for us. And that was a kind of quite natural transition into a practice. And I think this intuition from Shin allows you, well, at least that's how I started to make decisions in my life. I just followed it in a way and trusted that something will come after. And bit by bit, it started to build public works, I would say, at least from my trajectory. And I don't know, there was an interest in teaching, to stay close to education. I felt always that learning processes are quite important in our work. And I also wanted to be involved in teaching. So I first started teaching with Pascal, and then my former unit master from Unit 1, David Draxon. Yeah, so I was invited to set up an intermediate unit with him. So, and then I just stayed at the AA for another 7 years teaching. So while building a practice on the side. But so I don't know, it was quite fluent, I felt. It was, you know, one thing that I always wondered about the AA, and I tried to do work around it when I was in the AA, that the briefs that are set up are so much about individual practice. So you're so much about inventing your own realities and become somewhat a master of it, that logic or this manifesto you set out for yourself. And then how few people actually are entrepreneurial enough or daring enough to just do it. So there quite a lot of my friends ended up in quite big, interesting practices, but still their practice now is very much formed by the practice experience, not necessarily by the study, I would say. And that always kind of surprised me, because I felt you set yourself up over 2 years or 5 years, and why not pursue it? And yeah, I mean, we didn't earn much first 10 years, but I think it was still a really nice inquiry and a kind of pursuit of that, what I felt I articulated. Whether I knew how consciously I articulated it or not didn't really matter.
But it does sound like you need some space after education to kind of conclude your education
I think so. I think so. I mean, the proposal I put to Brett at one point was to do a residency model, but based on the artist placement group, where, I don't know, do you know the artist placement group? It's in the 60s, Barbara Stevini and John Latham, they set up the artist placement group, which negotiated space for artists in organizations. And they were kind of with an open brief. They were not prescribed what they have to do there or what the outcome needs to be. And I felt this insertions of practitioners into a context in which they have to create meaning. I always thought that was quite interesting. So I proposed that as why don't we, as the AA, leverage our influence and put a graduate from Carlos's unit into the GLA, and negotiate that space. Or it's a bit what public practice is doing now in a way, but more diverse. We're really pushing our graduates into practices and giving them like half a year or year of space in which to pursue, what they set out in the AA and make that transition into the non-academic space.
But so when you say that some kind of space needs to be negotiated, it means that it's not there in the first place.
Well, I don't know. It's. I think you have to create it your own by yourself, but it's not a given, no. And I think I always kind of relate to the art world, because in the art world you have a lot of residencies. You have an infrastructure that allows you to establish your practice. It's clear that after you've finished college, you've done your MA, you need support in becoming an artist. And there is an infrastructure there. I think in the architecture world, it's kind of assumed you go into an office and work. And I was interested to think, what infrastructure can we set up that maybe learns from the art world in some form? That's why I thought one idea was like a residency scheme that the AA drives for its graduates. But I still think this idea of, I mean, at CSM now, where I teach now, we send the MA students into a kind of term-long placement. And that placement is not an internship, it's not paid. So it mimics some of that, that artist placement group. But it's like field research, and students go, I don't know, they go kind of spend time in a music festival, they go to fabricators, they go to developers, they go to government, they go to non-for-profit organizations, they go to individual artists, practitioners. And that gives them an insight, but also it starts to build a network for them on which they can lean after leaving school. So if they want to pursue a practice that is alternative, that doesn't mean you have to go find a job in an architect's office, they learn already how to access it and possibly negotiate it. And I feel that's really quite crucial. If you want to change practice, I think that's one of the ways in which you can do it. And I feel we have to extend the practice and change it.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that's one of the...
Sorry, that's also a claim from the AA, that they set the tone for future practice in some form. Yeah, and I feel this, sorry, I'm ranting on, but I feel if you don't put an infrastructure in place, you favor those who have the privilege to do it with their own resources.
Yeah.
And that's where it becomes unjust, I feel.
So you're basically saying that there is a real responsibility on institutions to not just empower the individual students, but also to find kind of new ways in which institution can plug in to the system to allow students to kind of explore and even like find alternative forms of practice?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you have to take responsibility. If you say to students, look, architecture can be so much more, explore it, then they explore and come up with these wonderful projects. Then you have some form of responsibility to make sure that after college they don't just drop off the cliff, in a way, that they have some form of support. And for us, it's quite difficult, I guess, to resource that as institutions. But I think during the study, at least that's what we're doing at CSM, we're trying to make sure that the pathway they choose for themselves gets, that we build a network, or we call it community of practice, around it, that can carry them on into that direction. Yeah? And I do think that schools have a responsibility to see what comes up. They can't just rely on those who can afford it, in a way, to pursue it.
So that is one one side of the architectural education, is to or education in general, is to provide a certain sense of freedom as to what you can do after. But then what is the role of an education itself?
Yeah. Well, it's not so much a freedom for me, but I can give you an example. We had one student last year who is Annie, who is really into clubbing. And she is an architect, but she really feels very passionately about club culture. So she did her placement in a nightclub here in Canning Town, and kind of understood kind of the threat to nightlife, the kind of policy of kind of the GLA nightlife strategies, all that stuff is all very architectural, but they also felt that that there needs to be a unionization of nightclubs, etc., to kind of retain that space in the city. So it becomes very urban, I think, and strategic. And now, and you wonder kind of what the hell is she going to do with this? But now she found a job, and I forgot, I just got the email the other day, found a job exactly doing this, what she set out to do. And I think that was enabled through being so immersed in this network of nightclubs, having access to the people, going out to find these people, talking to them. And I think the education is directly set up to intervene in the field that they're interested in, and then challenge where that touches architecture. And I think that there is a responsibility, I feel, for us, if we want to change practice, to set students up so they can succeed in this. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But I'm just wondering, do you think that the role of education is to, in some way, emulate practice or emulate reality?
Well, I think the role of education is to provide a space which is safe, in which learning and exploration can happen, but which is also critical. So you have a space that is not, in a way, compromised, so you can't be critical. But at the same time, I fear it can't detach itself from the real world. And that dialogue between that kind of independent space of inquiry and how it meets the reality, how it meets people that are doing it, people that are against it, kind of allies or foes. I think that dialogue and that tension, for me, is quite important. So you see it in some studios, in Carlos' studios, you see it, people engage with institutions while also kind of being quite critical and observant of that situation. And I feel that that space of education, of being independent, inquiry-led, and explorative is quite important. But what I felt also often in architecture education, that you have these units that detach themselves so much, and it becomes such a detached speculation And I had students walk in and say, I just want to play for a year. I don't care if I draw toilets afterwards. This is my year and I find that a bit of a missed opportunity, a little bit. So yeah, I think that's, for me at least, what education should offer.
But so if you think back of that, I'm not sure which year that was, but it might be 1996 or 1997 when you went to Sarajevo with Pascal Schoening.
Yeah.
That is a kind of education that just doesn't really acknowledge any practical constraints or rules.
Well, first of all,
or it doesn't acknowledge reality.
Engaged with the very human side of life, I think. It engaged with war, trauma, rebuilding. It quite serious and fundamental topics where you then have to actually wonder, what the hell does architecture do within that, or can do? So it comes from a place of a very kind of human perspective, because you have to you can't just design a nice building in a way that doesn't make sense. So where do you articulate a brief or position for yourself there? So to that sense, you're right. There was no, it was not applied as such, but I did feel the way we were guided was to really kind of, it's a very human-centered perspective. And the work that came out of that really engaged with that quite deeply, I felt. So yeah, it might sound contradictory, because we kind of critique a lot now that you go somewhere for a week on a field trip, have fun, and then do a year-long work around it, completely detached. But I think that this impact, at least for us as a studio, of walking into a city 2 years after war that didn't have running water necessary, of electricity the whole time, and where you could see the war still very much present, was quite traumatic, or it was quite profound in many ways. And you felt you owe the situation a certain kind of seriousness.
Because that experience was so traumatic and so grave, it's maybe interesting to think about, how do you translate that level of quite visible trauma to London, where maybe the traumas are not so physical and so existential, but you can still kind of begin to identify these conflicts that are in a sense traumatic, but not on that kind of bodily destruction scale.
I would say the violence in London is different. Yeah, I agree with you. I guess Raoul set me up for London, I would say. I think London is quite contested as a space. I think it's kind of, especially like most of the development. I mean, the development here is a big industry, so it's constantly being developed, and constantly kind of an inequality, I would say, is being enshrined into the city. And I think a lot of our work is to kind of counter it, to respond to that kind of inequality that kind of reproduced through this dominant form of capital, in a way. So I think that's a kind of different form of violence, which is of course very different to a war, but it's still quite urgent, I feel. And I think especially public works is very London-based. The projects, of course, we do projects abroad, but the projects are quite focused on the locale, on the situations quite specifically, and they try to negotiate these contested spaces in some form. So yeah, it's
I mean, London is very central. It's the place where we can learn so much from, and the place we can engage with on so many levels, that it's really almost enough.
For me, it's not so much about the learning. I always felt that you know, as an architect, you're an agent that is sent into situation to, you're commissioned for a certain amount of time to go in and do something to a place. And I always felt the work we wanted to do, that framework doesn't quite fit. You have to be an actor that wears different hats. Yeah? You have to be, you know, if I go in as an agent and start measuring like an architect, I don't have much trust. Actually, people think they're quite suspicious of me. I think what's, you know, because I represent a change that sits somewhere in the future, and often I'm conceived as a threat. So if I want to change that relationship, I have to occupy a different role. Maybe I come in with the capacity that an architect has, but I'm also maybe, you know, in Hackney Wick, we had our studio there, we were a local business that was there, we were hanging out, we would run into people on the street. We were invested into the place in different ways, and that created a different relationship or a series of relationships and different forms of trust. And out of that being situated, kind of projects grow. So, and I think that's why the closeness to a site for us is important. And as we live in London, I think a lot of the work is here, and students work a lot in London. But having said that, I think it's important that you also feel like a certain bond, or you feel it should be meaningful. So a lot of students that come from abroad actually chose to do work at home, where they still have quite strong networks, but where they have a kind of understanding of the cultural, you know, language in a way, and have a certain authority because they're part of it. So I feel that is the important factor, that you're not this kind of detached agent coming in to on someone's behalf to promote a certain change, but that you construct different positions for yourself. Does that make sense?
Yes. And in that sense, the kind of whole professionalization of the field, there are all these like structures that, as a professional, again, as you said earlier, feed into the very specific form of practice, which is a kind of typical LLP or whatever it is today. I think what's interesting is that you're identifying space for practice that isn't a kind of maybe within that kind of professional framework.
I think if you look closely, there are other legal forms that you can apply. They're not maybe kind of very common or dominant, but there are different forms of JCT contracts that kind of promote collaboration and partnership. There are different forms of company structures or legal structures that allow, that enshrine different relationships. So I think that it can still be professional in the sense that you have a contract and you have services you deliver.
Yeah.
But I think the values you enshrine in the contract are maybe different.
So what's interesting about your practice is that it's non-for-profit.
I mean, non-for-profit, a lot of people think that we don't pay ourselves salary and we work for free.
No, of course.
That's a bit of course wrong. So non-profit mainly means that the profit the company generates is not paid out to stakeholders or shareholders.
Yeah.
So that you're not kind of dictated to or working on behalf of shareholders that you might not know or sit somewhere else. So the profit you create gets put back into the system after all the salaries and overheads are paid. And I think that's, I don't know if it's so unusual, but it's for us, you know, the projects we did for a long time, they didn't necessarily generate so much profit. We lived often, but there was not much to pay out anyway. But it kind of sets you up to work in a different field because you have access to funding in a different way. You are trusted in a different way because you're not coming in to extract necessarily, but you want to kind of reinvest and sustain. So, and I think that's a kind of important underlying principle. How it looks in the practice itself it's we are 7 at the moment, and we've made the decision that we're all equal and we're all directors. So there's quite a flat hierarchy, that we are all employed by Public Works, but we all have an equal mandate within it, whether it's us as founding members or kind of recent colleagues that joined more recently. And I think that's quite, for me, quite important, because everyone's driving their own work much more. I never liked this mentality, and that's maybe part of a traditional office setup. It's quite hierarchical. And I mean, I didn't feel comfortable coming in, sitting there 9 to 5, having to do these drawings and leave and have very little agency. And I'm also, as a kind of someone who leads an office, I never enjoyed having to motivate people to take a bigger interest in what they do and mobilize themselves, you know, not just see it as a job they have to come in and do. So the fact that we are all responsible for our own livelihoods still, and we all have to take care of that company's Public Works, creates a very different dialogue and atmosphere and participation between each other. And I think that's really precious to me.
I think one thing that was really interesting that you mentioned is the kind of learning from art world, or ways that artists develop their careers, and bringing those elements that you identify as quite useful and quite constructive into the field of architecture and into the kind of trajectory of a young architect. So I'm just wondering whether there are any other points in which we can learn, not necessarily just from art, but from other fields that you feel very strongly should be brought into
the conversation.
Into the conversation, yeah.
I mean, for me, the art world was important because it gave me a certain space that resonated with me quite a lot. There are other fields that are quite useful. In Hackney Wick, we work a lot with the geographer, and I think this grounding back into theory and into that discipline of geography and anthropology is quite important, I feel. Of course, the other industry, like the other kind of building, like engineering, all that is quite relevant. Economy, I think, more and more, you know, governance structures. So whether it's think tanks like New Economics Foundation, so we don't work with them directly, but you know, doing a lot of work around the commons at the moment, which is ultimately governance. That becomes quite crucial. So other forms of governance structures.
Because the commons are very much, that kind of conceptual idea is very much diluted between different fields. I mean, it does require a real kind of collaboration in order to generate any kind of physical manifestation, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be physical. So the commons debate is whether it's kind of a cultural commons or you know, in the computer world, what's called Creative Commons licenses. So I think they are kind of governance, I feel, and they kind of manifest themselves into different forms of objects or spaces in different ways. So I'm not sure if it's abstract. Maybe it is a bit abstract because we have to understand where the commons lies in relation to public or private. But you know, especially for Britain, you know, you have still pieces of land that are the commons, and so it is quite tangible as a kind of idea. That you have a piece of land and the community around it looks after it and shares its resources and also maintains it. So I feel that as an example is anchored in the British culture and makes it quite tangible. How you apply it and reapply it now in its new forms, I think that takes a little bit of a leap of imagination, I think.
And do you find that your practice is kind of engaged in that conversation?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, Torange, my colleague, she's set up the MA called Design for Cultural Commons. So her work is fully dedicated to the commons as a movement. And I think also the way I explained public works to be structured can be understood as a commons. The way we, as a community, see public works as a shared resource, and we all have the equal responsibility to maintain it and not to exploit it and to nurture it. And I think that that for us is a commons. Yeah. So we don't at the moment, I mean, we don't go out and say public works is a commons, but I think that is based on commons understanding to us. And a lot of the projects we go into, we promote that ethos, I would say, of kind of shared ownership. Whether it's, I don't know, many projects. Loughborough Junction is a good one. Yeah, again, where you try to set up the whole governance. Well, at least we get involved with the governance of the piece of work we've done, but how that is set up so it really kind of reinforms the local community that are the users ultimately. So the commons is quite important for us, I would say, as a kind of conceptual framework.
Yeah, and when we talk about conceptual frameworks, and I'm now taking this conversation back to where we were slightly earlier on, but the conceptual framework is also the architect is a kind of conceptual framework. And I think what's been interesting in recent years is that, you know, we've had practices or collectives like Assemble win, you know, Turner Prize or be dragged into the art world conversation and even be considered artists. So with that kind of acknowledgement, maybe being considered an artist.
Yeah, I never really mind. I mean, I never call myself artist because I don't feel my DNA comes really out of an architectural education. And I know friends have kind of decided to quite consciously to be artists now. I've always left it quite ambiguous. I do art commissions. I'm invited as an artist sometimes.
Yeah.
But I teach an architecture course in an art school.
Yeah.
I think that's quite a nice home for me because it's in dialogue with the other arts disciplines.
But you almost feel like those boundaries are not really important. Do they give us any kind of false sense of comfort sometimes?
I guess I'm and public works has always been interested on practices that lie at the edge. We're not so much interested in the center always. So in the center, these distinctions sometimes get a bit blurry anyway. And I think we are quite clear of what part of our method is at home in the art world or is at home in or influence or method is at home in which field where they come from. But I don't feel the need to constantly define myself. I'm obviously operating within an architectural kind of framework, but I do feel I bring different sensitivities or understandings to it from having a foot in another world as well. And I do think that's quite relevant. I mean, if we loop it back to the idea of changing practice, I think the change of practice happens through dialogues with other practices, I feel. And then you have to be immersed in those fields. So I personally, if I'm an architect or an artist, I don't really mind so much. I think the work starts to at one point speak for itself and different people respond to it and want to talk to you and work with you. But I never had the feel. Other people in public works had the desire to claim it as architecture, this is architecture. But I never felt the need so much to go back to the architects and convince them what we do is architecture. So what is nice is that it's somehow acknowledged. I run a course in architecture and it has its position. It is clearly a contribution to the architectural discourse. And but there was time, especially in the beginning of public works, where people didn't consider it architecture at all. And I never was so interested in convincing them.
Mm. I remember it must have been like Peter Eisenman or somebody making a comment on basically saying that we only need architects for big buildings or big monumental buildings, and that everything else is just, you know, non-architecture, or everything else is just, you know, gonna disappear in 10 years. So
I mean, that's where he wants to be, and
yeah,
that's what he wants to reproduce. I would disagree though, because I think the training and the skill of architects, I mean, architects are very rigorous and they think through scales, they're very systematic and methodical, and that can be really useful in many different situations. So I do think we need architects in all fields. I think they can, well, we don't need them, but they can make a contribution. Yeah. So the idea that we're only there to build big buildings is a bit reductive, I feel. And I mean, I don't like these big buildings. You know, I don't like these big buildings that are, yeah, I don't know. I mean, especially Peter Eisenman's work is kind of a dialogue with a very kind of narrow audience, I feel. And I do feel we have to speak to more people as architects. And I think in this current situation of, you know, climate crisis, Black Lives Matter, social justice, anti-racism, epidemic, we can't have such a narrow audience in mind who we sit in dialogue with. We have to really involve ourselves in kind of important issues.
I mean, the last year has been a really kind of paradigm shifting year. Your practice is called public works, but well, maybe the public space has been in some way reoccupied in the last year. But I'm just wondering how potentially this is one of these moments where we'll really be reassessing many things. And one of the things that we will be certainly reassessing, like there are many things that, you know, we might have overestimated or underestimated. But one thing that for sure we've reestablished as a kind of central to the discourse is the public space, because that's now being seen as a space of a civic space, really, more than ever before, because there is no other civic space, right? So I'm just wondering whether there's been some kind of shift in your perception or in your kind of thinking about publicness.
I think I would frame it slightly different. I think we have always had an awareness in public space and how it's being undermined, how it's being sold off, how publicly owned spaces are being reduced. So now you have privately owned public realm, which effectively is private. You can't protest on there in the same way. You can't use it as another civic space. What I feel has come to the fore, at least for me, is spaces that are communal in a way, where community can form and support each other. For example, again, I'm mentioning the work in Loughborough Junction, it's kind of a community cafe, community garden involved, etc. These spaces and these networks that make these spaces suddenly became very instrumental as mutual aid networks. And these are communal spaces or commons, I feel, and these spaces are being undermined. So if you look at, you know, housing, you don't have, these are the spaces that fall away, where you can be in community with those around you. And I feel that's a real lack, because that kind of gives support structures that can have, that support each other locally, but also take influence locally. And I think that's undermined. And public realm offers a place where these things can play out, but I think it's more than public realm. It's how we design communal spaces. And I think that comes to the fore. The other thing that came to the fore is the complete lack of green space, and that the access to green space is really unequal. Or the access to space, full stop, it's unequal. If you're locked into a small flat and have a long way to a public ground that you can't send your kids out to play because, you know, when you have to work. So I think there's a lot of injustice within how public realm, parks, green space is distributed and being accessed. And that came to the fore for me. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
I mean, I just read a few days ago that this is the worst economic crisis or fall in GDP, or you know, it's always hard to understand what exactly they mean. But whatever it is, it's the worst since 1703. You know, and then you're thinking, well, you know, I haven't had any, you know, existential threats to my life in terms of economic survival. I mean, not that I need very much to survive, but then it tells you that probably somebody has felt it quite badly if it really is the worst whatever since 1703, you know.
But also we will start to feel it, you know, we will
start to feel it.
Once we have to start paying back all that money that is being spent now, and when Brexit hits, I mean, it's gonna be quite. I think the inequality will be enshrined further. I mean, what gives me hope is that there's a lot of movement against it, and there's a kind of hopefully a memory out of COVID about other values that have come to the fore. So let's see. But I think from a governmental side, I think I'm not too optimistic in a way. They're talking already of cuts to, you know, whatever. You know, cuts to services that are quite crucial in a way to a lot of vulnerable people.
The outside world feels slightly different because, you know, there is this kind of 2-meter thing, but it's much more than that, you know, that is a kind of real physical imposition. But
I've never seen parks and green spaces so full, you know, even there's a real kind of remembering of green spaces, but also, you know, we have a community garden we set up. There's a real desire to garden or to be involved with soil and land and use it, not just kind of sit in it, but actually to be productive with it. And I think that's really nice that kind of reemerges. And I hope we still have the time to continue that, because there's a real kind of turn to nature in a way, that as a kind of healing and nurturing kind of factor. And I do hope that comes and that stays. And I think it gets in, I mean, at least in my world, it gets more and more dominant because the biodiversity loss and climate crisis, you have to live with nature and reassess your relationship to nature in a different way. And hopefully that carries forward.
You know, the green spaces have become the only spaces where we can go that is not our house and the kind of shops to buy food, but perhaps also our relationship with the domestic space is changing, right? Because we've never been so domesticized. There is this whole kind of domestic life that we've never lived.
I mean, I enjoy parts of it. I really, because I always felt like our house was something we just rush in at night and rush out in the morning. And London always demands so much of your office and you want to take part in it. So you're always in London, and not like the home is never, or for us at least, it wasn't such a calm place where you hang out. And I think that was a really nice time. We were just a lot at home. We've been working more than we've ever worked, I feel, but we were together and we were at home, and it was, the idea of home changed in a really nice way. The intrusion of work into the home is maybe something else, and then how you start to separate that a bit more. But I blame that more on the computer. But But I think, being home more and also kind of grounding yourself at home has been really positive for us.
I guess it's a bit difficult for students, perhaps, because
I completely. I mean, I'm in a privileged position. We have, I'm not a visitor to town. I've been here for 30 years. I'm anchored here quite a lot. I have students that are quite new, maybe foreign. For them, it can be really hard. And it's also, especially for students, you learn most from your peers. You're detached from them. You're at home. You kind of the whole struggles you have learning. Suddenly are isolated in your bedroom, and it's not great. And I admire them because they've been bravely kind of soldiering on and doing quite amazing work. And but it's really difficult circumstances. And I think we have to be really careful not to take it for granted in a way.
The domestic space has been rethought and reappropriated, and also the digital space somehow as well. But these kind of corridors in public buildings and in institutions, which is where you actually get in this kind of subtle conversation.
But I wonder, I've spoken to architect friends who start to think differently how they design homes now, or housing, because because they spend so much time at home, and because they've kind of reconsidered themselves what it is like to be at home, what's important about being home. And that's, corridors like this, again, goes back to these communal spaces where you're not just isolated within your four walls, which before this kind of individualization that you just go home and it's my home. And the need for companionship or neighborliness or communion has become really evident, and that needs to be close by has become really. So I really hope that it kind of filters into the way we design and push for housing going forward.
So are there any things that you think you will kind of, as a result, immediately try to feed into the education that you will provide for students in the years to come?
Out of COVID?
Yeah, out of just this year of realization and introspection.
I think for us, Black Lives Matter had a massive impact, I feel, with social justice, anti-racism, decolonizing, how we much more actively look at, I think, the personal experience and how work comes out and is supported out of that personal experience. And I think for me that's quite exciting, but it's also quite it's a reflective process, which can be destabilizing. That has been, I think, really really strong in terms of how we think about education, how we change the course. The other one is clearly the climate crisis, that it is increasingly urgent. And how do we, on the one hand, students come in, want to put themselves into the service of, and also we have to be much more explicit how we address it. And those two fields are really have come to the fore, on top of what we've already been doing, which was around social justice, spatial justice. So so that is definitely not going to go away, I feel, and that's the kind of setup. I also feel we will embrace more crises. I do feel the climate crisis. So how we respond to this is how do we react, respond, undo those crises? It's very much has moved to the center, I feel. So it's work, but I think really rewarding.
Just to look at Central St. Martin's, which is a place where there are so many different creative fields under one roof. I've always wondered, what are those opportunities within education, but also potentially direction that we can take after we've been educated, to diverge and to do different things. And again, my kind of starting point in this thought is Central St. Martin's as a place where you, unlike the AA, so it might be interesting if you can just draw that parallel in terms of exposure to all these other things, and whether that is something that will become even more critical in kind of facilitating creative production, or just facilitating architects realizing that they can contribute to all these different fields.
I think it's more that we can learn how to do things differently. I do feel like the architectural education, for example, the whole unit system, the whole hierarchy that's enshrined through it is being reproduced, and there's very little movement to step out of it. But when I sit in as a kind of small course, one of 50 other art disciplines, and you see how other disciplines even structure their learning, and how they structure projects, and how they kind of form different relationships, they do things in very different ways. And they kind of relate to their professional buddies in a different way. They kind of set up, the voice of the student might be different, the kind of value system within the course. So they do things differently. And I think that, for me, has been really important, that you have that dialogue, that you actually kind of see, you know, I'm just reproducing an education that I've went through without questioning, that I know it's familiar, and therefore I think, yeah, that's great, let's do it. I want to have my unit, I want to dictate the brief. And so a lot of the work we've been doing in CSM is trying to undo this, you know, trying to, you know, what would the peer learning look like? What is if you don't have a unit system? What if you have a festival instead of a review? Or how do you build in empathy and scrutiny at the same time? So I think that there's a room for doing things differently and experimenting with these setups that I think are facilitated strongly through the art school context. I think you reproduce a certain aesthetic that comes out of a unit. And I think what's important, if you want to connect to a student's lived experience, they have to express themselves maybe in a different way that informs a different aesthetic, which might not be recognized in the architectural world so much. And that's where we have to do unlearning ourselves. So if, you know, if some students, and that's great to be in an art school, if some students do large paintings that for an architect look a bit weird in the beginning, but actually they resonate with other disciplines quite clearly, I think that can be really reassuring. And you start to trust that has validity in a way, these other forms of expression and of producing work. And I think that's where the new arrives in some form. So I do feel it's really important that we undo this kind of structures a little bit. And I think even the question, should we be part of the RIBA? Should we be accredited part 2 or should we not? I mean, that you would never ask that of yourself in an architecture school. So this undoing or maybe decolonizing is really useful to do in this context. And in terms of other disciplines, yeah, I think for me I still very strongly believe, and that's what I liked about Alvin. I think he put the portfolio at the center and everything else comes through it. And I think for me, I read that the desire or the position of the student is the center, what they kind of want to do, and how the course helps them articulate that and form that, and then helps to build relationships. And of course, there it's really good that you have other disciplines around you. So if someone is interested in, I have a student really interested in biodesign, you know, then she can get engaged with a biodesign course. If someone else wants to, you know, tends to drift into fashion, they can make friends with fashion students and strike up a collaboration. And I think on that level, it's super fruitful. How you maybe, you know, for us, it's quite important how you perform your work. and kind of being in touch with the performance design and practice course is great. So you have, you kind of intuitively sometimes pick up ways from other disciplines, and you can then just check in with them, and that dialogue I think is really, really fruitful. And often, architects are quite stern. They carry the world on their shoulders always. They still have that tendency of God, we live in that complexity. Huh?
Weltschmerz.
Weltschmerz, yeah, a little bit. So even on a basic level that other people around you are more, I do think it's a limit, say, in a place of the AA, that it's so mono-discipline. Of course, there's a lot of variety within it, but I do fear it. I always fear at the AA, the architect is the center of the universe, where I don't fear that, and I quite enjoy that at CSM.
I think it was really interesting what you said about, how different creative fields completely differently approach learning.
Yeah. I mean, with architecture, I notice it a lot. Like, we work through representation, of course. We can't build the building to show it to you, but a fashion designer or a jewelry designer, they make the piece, and you talk about the piece. Yeah. So you react to the object and to the kind of embodied idea. With architecture, you often talk about what you might want to do in the future. So it's always that bit more removed. And I think that kind of talking about design in a more direct way is always like deferred a little bit, I feel, in architecture. There is, first of all, there's a lot of justification why you do it, how you would do it, and then actually you get to the object, and maybe also the way the object is looked at through other disciplinary eyes is very different. So getting to the object is longer. You have to kind of represent it, but then also how it is being not judged